So the book that Neil mentioned that will be coming out next year, I'm actually currently in, how can I put this politely, negotiation with the publisher about the title. So at the moment it is The Cultural History of Manila, but it may change as we go along. But what I really just wanted to do tonight is or this evening, is just to try and talk about some of the key observations, some of the key arguments of that book. This is necessarily going to be quite a fast-moving general summary, so forgive me in advance for that. It's not as sort of detailed as it could be, but obviously there's only so much amount of time, and it's a big book. So, but I guess we can go into more detail in the Q&A or afterwards if we, in discussion about anything that you want me to go into more detail about. So, I guess whenever you write a book or get interested in a particular kind of research area or object of study, there are a number of reasons why you do it. I have a number of I suppose, sort of personal and academic reasons for getting interested in the Philippines. I've been interested in the Philippines for the last 9 or 10 years. As a reporter, as someone who's done sort of journalism there, as someone who's written, I'm now writing a novel that's partly set in the Philippines, and what I'm going to talk to you about today is sort of an academic analysis of aspects of that country. Another reason that I wrote this book was that I'm a big fan, as other people may well be, of Edward Said, and particularly his seminal book, Orientalism, which I'm sure you're aware of, Said there, and then some of the sort of stereotypes and representational models that Said deconstructs and interrogates in that book. And, as I'm sure you'll know, whereas Said's critical purview is mainly focused on sort of French and British discursive constructions of the Arab world, North Africa and the Middle East, during what we might call the modern period. In the more than 40 years since Orientalism came out, you've had a number of scholars that have adapted its theoretical framework and applied it to other imaginative geographies, to use Said's own term, relating to the Indian subcontinent, to Latin America, to sub-Saharan Africa, to East Asia, and to a number of other parts of the world. So in a similar kind of spirit, what I'm trying to do with my research is to apply some of the paradigms of Said's Orientalist discourse analysis to a lineage of signifying practices related to Manila, which is the capital city of the Philippines, which is a part of the world that has largely been overlooked by critics. There are some honourable exceptions to that, and I will be mentioning them as we go along. So in a conscious allusion to Orientalism, I've coined the term, and I'm afraid this is a bit of an ugly tongue twister, Manilaism, to describe a trajectory of British and American writing mostly British and American writing on Manila from the early 18th century, which is the sort of earliest example that I can find that kind of fits the criteria that I'm using, which I'll explain in a moment, is a sort of fictional, what do you call it, somewhere between a kind of travelogue and a work of fiction by Daniel Defoe, who people will be well aware of as a great figure in the English literary canon. And it goes from sort of Defoe and some of his contemporaries right the way up to present-day writings by novelists, travel writers, journalists like Jonathan Miller, who I think his sort of day job is as a reporter for Channel 4 News, but he wrote a book quite recently about President Duterte of the Philippines. So there's this, as I say, there's this sort of longish trajectory that imagines the city as a textual space focused on a number of imperialist, but also more latterly neo-imperialist, colonialist, but more latterly neo-colonialist, and ethnocentric assumptions in the way that those writers, those European writers that Said focused on, from Byron to Flaubert to Marx to other figures, were sort of living or representing the Arab world according to certain sort of assumptions. So over the 4 centuries of this Manilaist trajectory, these assumptions have compelled writers to pass generally negative value judgments on a host of matters affecting Manila, related to class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, economics and business, labour, human development, and social and governmental policy. So, in addition to Said and other critics in that kind of Orientalist mould, my approach is informed by, I suppose, a kind of an older tradition, a longer standing tradition of literary criticism, which is the philological discipline, in which the historical context of literary work is integral to a proper understanding of it. And also to a number of other critics. I'll just mention one other, who is an American critic called Jennifer M. McMahon, who's one of the few theorists to focus on Western literature concerning the Philippines. And her suggestion, which I found quite useful, that postcolonial analyses of culture and language should be grounded by historically contextualizing these phenomena and always keeping in mind both the physical and cultural violence of colonization. So I've tried to reconcile these, what you might call textualist and materialist modes of analysis, by closely reading the tropes and formal techniques in texts, Manilaist texts going right through, as I say, from the early 18th century up to the present, while at the same time positing their affiliations with these wider social, political, and economic conditions. This is obviously quite an ambitious task, and it could be a boundless, endless exercise. Indeed, you could probably devote an entire book to just analysing all the sort of material historical forces underpinning just one American writer's slur against Chinese-Filipinos from, I don't know, 1903 or something like that. So, obviously, I can't pursue every sort of line of inquiry and try to look at every single potential determinant behind these texts. But I hope that at least I can sort of try and give some sense of this, the interplay between the world and the sort of textual productions or the textual epiphenomena that come out of it. But why only focus on Manila, you may be thinking? Well, you might not be thinking that, but other people have asked me about it, and so I feel the need to justify it. So I've chosen to consider material that reflects on Manila rather than on other regions of the Philippines, or indeed other cities in the Philippines, for, again, a number of reasons. Firstly, because, as the British author James Hamilton-Paterson argues, Manila remains the nipple from which the world takes most of its information about the Philippines. Hamilton-Paterson wrote that in 1987, but actually even a cursory glance of the foreign sections of Western newspapers, websites, magazines, and so on will show you that it's just as true today. Moreover, the vast majority of Anglo-American writing on the Philippines is engaged to some degree or other with the capital city, and much of it exclusively so. These authors' fixation on Manila is arguably also attributable to its significance not only to Philippine history, but also the history of Southeast Asia and, I would argue, world history. Manila was in many respects the site in which certain key turning points occurred in the history of Western imperialism. It played a role, you could argue, in the rise of European colonial mercantilism in Asia in the sort of 16th, 17th centuries. In 1697, the English seaman William Dampier called Manila a place of great strength and trade. And also, arguably, Manila was the site in which the Spanish Empire came to a rather sticky end at the hands of the United States in the Spanish-American War. And then what led directly to that was, I think, an even more important sort of historical event, which is really the rise of the United States to global imperial hegemony. And we're obviously still living in that, in the sort of consequences of that now. If you go fast forward to World War II, Manila was a strategic desideratum for both sides, for the Axis and the Allies. There was some sort of extraordinarily heavy fighting that took place, and indeed there are lots of narratives that I'll be referencing in a moment that deal with that. And then on to the Cold War, when the Philippines shifted from being a colony of the US, it gained its formal independence in 1946, but nonetheless it remained a sort of a subject, if you like, of what Pankaj Mishra dubs America's informal empire, shown up by military bases, economic pressures, and military coups. In that time, Manila became the absolute epitome of a global southern urban sprawl in the clutches of what's been called dollar imperialism, both as a font of profitable human and natural resources there for taking, there for exploiting by the US, but also as a market, increasingly important, is a market for US manufactured commodities. And this kind of economic relationship also comes to have a quite profound effect on the sorts of books and articles and travelogues that get written at this time. From the late 20th century up to the present day, Manila has been something of a bellwether for what the historian Neil Ferguson has determined as the descent of the West and the reorientation of the world towards Asia. So the city's economic ties to the US and Europe have loosened, though not vanished in that time, as the Philippines has established commercial relationships with Japan, South Korea, other Asian neighbours, and most recently and most significantly China. That said, as we will see later on, there is a risk of overstating, I think, the Philippines and Manila's pivot to these other nations because it still maintains very close economic and cultural ties with the US. So the other question I would just try to answer is why focus only on literature, which would be a fair point. I know that we're in a department, sort of interdisciplinary department here. There are film scholars and TV scholars and things like that. So first kind of reason I would give for that, or justification I would give for that, is that while over the years films, TV programs, advertisements, public relations brochures, political speeches, online content and other media have helped to manufacture certain external perceptions of Manila and the Philippines, there have not been enough of them over a lengthy enough period to constitute a coherent discourse as such. However, the research that I've done over the last decade has revealed that Westerners have been writing novels, travelogues, memoirs, and works of literary journalism set in Manila since, as I say, the early 18th century, and that there are enough common concepts, sentiments, formal devices, symbolic devices that can be traced all the way through them up to the present day. So there's more of a kind of coherent discourse there. So that's one good reason to look at only literature. And I'd say whereas in Orientalism, Said engages with what he admits is a broadly construed field of theories, epics, novels, social description, and political accounts, my emphasis is actually narrower than that, on popular literary genres, mostly memoirs, travelogues, and novels. And these genres have been the Anglo-American public's main source of information about Manila. The novels in particular have, according to the American literary critic Morton J. Netzorg, appealed to a mass audience and had some chance of shaping American public ideas or impressions about the Philippines. As well as prose fiction, Western colonialist travelogues have, so argues Debbie Lyle, the critic of travel writing, a special capacity for disseminating the goals of empire because stories of faraway lands were crucial in establishing the unequal, unjust, and exploitative relations of colonial rule. As Patrick Holland and Graham Huggan contend similarly, such travel narratives textually produce the non-European world according to Western fixations, i.e. the Congo was for Joseph Conrad, they argue, a mirror to the dark side of the soul, and the Amazon was regarded as a happy hunting ground by plucky adventurers. Okay, so the first, basically these sort of representational models that I look at broadly divide into constructions or representations of individuals and groups, social and ethnic groups, and of physical places, physical zones of Manila, or Manila as a kind of urban geographical location. And the first one that I want to share with you is what I call Manila as hell. And this is perhaps the most memorable, dramatic and enduring lens through which the Manilaists have gazed at the city. You can chart this back to sort of early Victorian era, I think. I mean, again, the danger of teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, as the old phrase goes. I don't want to, I'm sure you may well be aware of the fact that Western literature has been likening cities and urban spaces to the sort of Christian notion of hell for hundreds of years. At one end of this spectrum of representations, you could argue, are urban spaces that are sort of mildly redolent of hell, or that have hell-like or hellish features, which might be explicable rationally within the terms of a narrative in what Tzvetan Todorov, inspired by Freud, of course, calls the uncanny, At the other end of this sort of spectrum of, if you like, metaphorical intensity are cities that are closer imitations of hell. The classic example is the fiery metropolis of Dis in Dante's Inferno poem, as it has been limned in religious texts, and that therefore belong to Todorov's category of the fantastic, where people and places and narratives are only comprehensible in supernatural terms. Further to this, what I'm interested in with regard to sort of my analysis is that each of these sort of textual cities is shaped, of course, by cultural and material determinants specific to its historical moment of origin. So, for example, Joan M. Ferrante, the literary critic, observes that Dante populated Dis with heretics because that particular sin was intimately associated, she writes, with politics for Dante's audience. And the politics of the time were notable for Pope John XXII's clampdown on opponents who rejected Christian dogma, and also for the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II's conflation of religious dissent with sedition. So that was all very much, Ferrante argues, these sort of current affairs at the time very much feeding into Dante's work. Similarly, the Manila as hell trope coheres, I think, to some extent with Todorov's and Ferrante's observations, as well as Orientalist idée fixe about the inferiority of Eastern spiritual and religious beliefs, mores, and political economic structures, as, of course, talked about by Edward Said, but more specifically to the findings of Alain Grosrichard, he's a contemporary of Said. His book came out, I think, a year after his book on Oriental despotism. But for some reason, Gaurushard is not remembered and hasn't sort of achieved quite the same status as Said. But his thesis was that there were French Enlightenment commentators of the sort of 17th and 18th centuries on the Arab world who conceived of that part of the world as a despotic state that tends to reduce itself to one vast single city surrounded by an infinity of ruins and fallow land. So there was this kind of notion of a diabolical, sort of hellish city that somehow symbolised the Orient for Gaurushard. Aside from targeting and you find this kind of these sorts of tropes in the works of Manilist writers from this time, aside from targeting the savage Asians, the cynicisms of Said's and Gaurushard's Orientalisms, the early exponents of Manila's hell, such as the US sailor Charles Wilkes and the British coffee trader and diarist Nicholas Loney, are strongly critical of what they see as the illiberal, impious, and arcane Spanish colonial regime. So I was sort of odd. This guy's Nicholas Loney looks quite a lot like Charles Dickens. I don't know whether they were related or perhaps in some random way. But so these were British. Wilkes was a US sailor who came in with the US Navy and spent some time in Manila in the sort of 1830s, and he was appalled by the Spanish regime, the Spanish colonial regime that was ruling the Philippines at the time, and talked about it as being so cruel as to be a disgrace to the records of the 19th century. Perhaps sort of, not properly putting that into the context of what the British and French empires were up to at exactly the same time, which is arguably much worse. But Nicholas Loney talks in this way that Gaurushard does about the kind of Arabian city or the Turkish city as this kind of fallow sort of, it's about energy grows listless and benumbed, is one of his lines about Manila. As being kind of mismanaged or badly run by the Spanish. And what I think is interesting here is that, there's, if you look back at sort of Orientalist stereotypes, they tend to focus on non-Europeans, non-Westerners, and that's certainly true of Said, it's certainly true of Gaurushard. But in this instance, there's this kind of fear and loathing of the Spanish, who are fellow Europeans, but they're sort of somehow inferior Europeans. There may be reasons for this. So in the mid to late 1800s, absolutely contemporary with these writers, British and American imperial rivalries with Spain and other European states produced a racially based Anglo-Saxon consciousness. which was promoted by a number of people, a guy called Charles Dilke, who was a British parliamentarian at that time, Cecil Rhodes, rightly controversial figure today and recently. These are all big supporters of this idea of the sort of Anglo-Saxon sort of consciousness. And this was regarded, well, all kinds of other cultures as being inferior, but it regarded Spanish politics, culture, and religion as fundamentally inferior. There was a kind of response to this, which is called Latinidad in parts of Latin America, and supported by the kind of Latin-speaking intellectuals in the countries in Europe that have Latin-based languages. As a kind of response, a sort of a brotherhood or a fraternity of people speaking Latin-based languages, as a kind of response to the Anglo-Saxonism. And so really, these sorts of prejudices percolate into the perceptions of these sort of characters. In fact, Lomi quite overtly at one point, talks about how the Spaniard and the English, the Anglo-Saxon can never really get along. They can never see eye to eye. They can never kind of be friends in that way, despite coming from both being European and both having a sort of certain common historical backgrounds. So the other thing here, I think, to bear in mind is I think it's probable that in the Manilaist mind, the sloth, the greed, the tyranny of the Spanish in Manila and the kind of horrible, hellish city that it creates is not only a congenital fact of their Spanishness or Latinness, but a consequence of their having spent too much time in the East among Easterners who exhibit those same deficiencies. Now, there's this notion of going native, which I think has acquired a strangely fluffy and kind of almost jokey, people sort of go to Australia for 2 weeks, young British people go to Australia for 2 weeks, come back with a thick Australian accent and they say, oh, you've gone native, and it's kind of fun and fluffy and okay. But actually going native from a kind of post-colonial perspective was something a lot more problematic and viewed that way at the time. So there was this notion European settlers in Asia, Oceania and Africa were perceived to have wholly degenerated from contact with other races. Benjamin Kidd, who was another Western British writer a little bit later than the period we're looking at the moment, talked about in climactic conditions which were a burden to him in the midst of races in a different and lower stage of development, divorced from the influences which have produced him, from the moral and political environment from which he sprang, the white man tends himself to sink slowly to the level around him. And I think there is something of this attitude towards the Spanish that they have been infected somehow by having spent far too long ruling or out in the boondocks. So as the British travel writer from that era, James McMicking, wrote in 1850, many of the natives of Spain who are even now selected to fill the highest offices are about as despotic and as unscrupulous as any Asiatics in their notions of government and in their exercise of power. And similarly, this sort of links back to Gaurushard, because he talks about how writers like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Michel now devised physical determinist formulations about climate biology and racial typology to conclude that Oriental societies are fundamentally authoritarian in character. Tropical weather, these writers asserted, makes Asians excessively sensitive to the least threat of danger, and therefore naturally made to be slaves under sultans who, as a result of the same burning hot climate, suffer from a laziness of mind and a lasciviousness of body. Correspondingly, McMicking notes that the heat of the climate probably disposes those living in Manila against sterner and self-denying mental duties. Very Victorian sort of idea, that, isn't it? Spanish soldiers are effeminate defenders, and Spanish priests routinely take mistresses despite it openly violating their Catholic faith. So just moving forward a little bit, in the first third of the 20th century, when the US, by this point the US had supplanted the Spanish as the colonial overlords of Manila and the Philippines, you have foreign correspondents, mostly American foreign correspondents, travel writers, including George A. Miller and Walter Robb, draw on similar sort of imagery to those previous writers to reinforce a contrast between the barbaric residues of Spanish cultural influence, this notion that Spain had, somehow kind of become a kind of retarded cultural force in the Philippines, to contrast that with the sort of new American promises of moral, social, and technological improvement. When the United States went into the Philippines, they used the rhetoric of, bringing democracy to the sort of benighted peoples, and bringing sort of new liberal ideas and new progressive ideas to a part of the world that was in need of them and had been sort of suffered at the hands of the Spanish for so long. So moving forward a little bit to World War II, Western fiction writers, memoirists and correspondents, kind of following on from the tropes that Rob and Miller are invoking, construct a war-torn Manila as hell, in which the heretical, atavistic Japanese are destroying or have destroyed everything precious that liberal, magnanimous American imperialism had ostensibly introduced to the scene. Freedom, the rule of law, political progress, and Protestantism, amongst other things. When after the war the Philippines was granted independence from the US but became a politically unstable client state of the US empire, Manilaist demonology finds fresh targets: the toxic ubiquity of superstition, cruel Faustian hoodlums and caciques, which is a term for sort of thuggish political chiefs, and diabolical scenes of third world poverty. P.J. O'Rourke, Ian Baruma, and others are some of the front covers of the books there. Resurrect the sort of city as hell trope, but infuse it with what Mary Louise Pratt terms third world blues, which is a tendency within Western travel writing to depict non-Western cityscapes as grotesque, joyless, horrific places. The attitude is often driven by a kind of pessimism and unexamined guilt towards societies that have freed themselves from Western colonial oppression, though not necessarily from indirect manipulation and exploitation through the sort of global capitalist system. Pratt holds that the two prime exponents of third world blues, the travel writers Paul Theroux and Alberto Moravia, are oblivious to the global causes of the local quandaries they mention in their respective works, because they refuse the history tying the North American Theroux to Spanish America or the Italian Moravia to Africa, despite the fact that much of what they are lamenting is the depredations of Western-induced dependency. And very similar things are going on, certainly if anyone's read Holidays in Hell. I mean, just the front cover alone gives you a kind of sense of that this isn't going to be a hugely sort of self-reflective and sort of kind of very broad analysis of why it is that there are, slums and incredible poverty and sex tourism, all these things that O'Rourke witnesses. There's never a moment thought about how this might be a kind of consequence of, the Philippines being in a kind of subordinate position in a very unequal economic relationship with the United States, let alone the kind of legacies of colonialism that have impoverished countries like the Philippines and continue to do so. So just to sort of round off this particular trope, I sort of talk about the Manila is hell trope by the turn of the millennium is sort of coinciding with new neuroses about the Philippines' drift away from exclusively Western cultural economic domination, which I mentioned earlier. But also a sort of an abiding keenness, perhaps as a result of that, among these Western writers to contain the city within primitive pre-industrial symbolism. This idea that it can't develop, it can't advance. And this is very interesting because it contrasts strongly with this sort of perception of techno-Orientalism, it's been called, in which other nations such as China and Japan are instead sort of fetishized or stereotyped for being somehow kind of very advanced technologically and therefore a kind of threat to Western economic power and so on and so forth. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of focus now on a slightly narrower historical period and just look at the way that the sorts of the way that the sort of Manilaist representations relate to writing, sort of mostly again American but some British fiction and travel writing. published in the prelude and during the American conquest of the Philippines in 1898, which was arguably the foundational event in US imperialism and bore chilling parallels to later US campaigns in Vietnam, Iraq, and lots of historians have made these sort of comparisons. If you notice here, anyone see what's going on here? What kind of form of torture? Waterboarding, called the water cure at that time. This was the first, we recognise this probably from the Iraq War, right, where this became extremely scandalous because American soldiers were effectively using this or American operatives were using this as a method of torture. It was first used in the Philippines on the Filipino revolutionaries. So yes, there were sort of techniques of strategic hamleting that they'd use in Vietnam. There were very similar kind of massacres of civilians on the pretext that, well, we can't tell them apart from the sort of undercover revolutionaries, and so there are lots of for an asymmetrical war, it really kind of started. The Philippine-American War really, kind of set the scene for future conflicts. So the novelists William Henry Thomas, Charles King, Edward Stratemeyer, better known for the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries. He wrote a series of boys' own sort of propaganda, very propagandistic adventure novels for kids, for young men, celebrating the American campaign in the Philippines. And Archibald Clavering Gunter, I just love that name, Archibald Clavering Gunter. An excuse just to say that name as often as possible is good by me. It's a great writer's name, I think. And others mobilise a range of rhetorical devices and narrative strategies to, first of all, subtly enjoin the overthrow of the Spanish in Manila in the lead up to the war. And then later on, omit, distort, or excuse the often brutal conduct of the US Armed Forces in the Spanish-American and Philippine-American Wars. There are lots of examples of this, and this is where I get quite interested in kind of linguistics and linguistic devices and rhetorical devices. But I'll just, because we don't have loads of time, I'll just give you one particularly kind of extreme and slightly absurd example of what I mean. On the one occasion in this book, The Campaign of the Jungle, 1900, which is Edward Stratemeyer, which is sort of follows the fortunes of these young lads. They're all brothers fighting for Uncle Sam, in the Philippines. Being good, patriotic, jingoistic lads, as you were expected to be in 1900, I suppose. And there's this moment when there's a scene where in a kind of fight, sort of fight scene, where a US soldier kidnaps a native woman and carries her on his back as a kind of human shield before discarding her unceremoniously in a forest. Now, the reader is not at all invited to feel any kind of compassion for the woman or disapproval for the soldier. Quite the opposite. It is, as Stratemeyer writes, a stroke of good luck that the woman happens to be a close relative of a rebel chief who won't fire on them because he doesn't want to kill his close relative. So there's a bizarre, that's perhaps to be expected in these sorts of discourses, maybe, but it's not only is it a sort of a strange process of kind of moral alchemy whereby the entirely selfish, dangerous and exploitative behaviour of the soldier that risks the life of a completely innocent bystander is converted into a kind of feat of heroism, and of ingenuity. Not only is it that, but I suppose it's also a way of, in reality, war crimes were far more common on the American side. Many more massacres and those sorts of sort of terrible behaviours amongst the Americans. So I think it's a way really of by having a scene like that, it tries to sort of deflect away from the fact that the reality was that actually the American soldiers were very much following a kind of, it's been called a genocide, right? Because I think 1/5 of the population ended up perishing in that conflict. So just the Campaign of the Jungle and a lot of these sort of adventure novels that come out of this period belong to what Martin Green, in his study of imperial and colonial fiction, Dreams of Adventure, Deeds of Empire, which I strongly recommend, defined as the Western adventure novel whose propagandistic purpose was to mythologize empire and prepare young men to go out to the colonies to rule and their families to rejoice in their fates out there. And the political reasoning of these myths, green rights, was to make imperialism palatable to Western readerships by obscuring its flaws, excesses, and injustices. And I think, this is a tradition that continues today, I think, in media discourses, albeit more subtly. You can find that, it manifests itself in the rhetoric of, humanitarian intervention and just war, and so on, which we've seen in the sort of debates around interventions in Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or contemporary wars. So, yes, moving swiftly on and back to, and really on to a specific group, a specific ethnic group within Manila who are very significant, the Chinese-Filipinos. And this is a quote from Daniel Defoe's book, A New Voyage Around the World. And this is a very brief moment where it's a kind of fictionalized account of a guy who travels around the world, or a group of British sailors who sort of travel around the world. And they, close to Manila, they encounter some Chinese traders. I won't read this out, but essentially there are all the kind of coordinates of later stereotypes, misrepresentations of the Chinese, Chinese-Filipinos or Chinese near or in Manila are sort of established in the very first text that I can find by a Westerner dealing with this particular issue. So, he talks about sort of strange, ugly, ill-looking fellows they were. And then they're particularly effective at trading. They're mean and parsimonious, and we took a good sum of money off them besides, but whither they went we knew not, for they both came and went in the night too, as the other did. So there's something kind of shadowy and mysterious about they come from nowhere and they come from the night and they sort of disappear into the night. So all of this, I think, intriguingly, then is all these sorts of these characteristics, these tropes, then developed later on. So these representations become very convoluted because the Chinese community in Manila has historically been demonized not only by Western visitors, but by the Spanish colonialists, but also by the majority Malay-Filipino population for a variety of, again, complex and contradictory reasons. The Chinese as skinflint entrepreneurs, perhaps the oldest heterostereotype in the repertoire. As I say, it's Defoe inaugurates it there. But a century or more later, Charles Wilkes, who we mentioned earlier, and William Henry Tomes conflate disquiet about Chinese migration to the UK and US at that time with disquiet about Chinese economic activity in Manila. And while these authors revere the enterprising spirit of the Chinese, they see something of the Western go-ahead capitalist mindset in this community, so they're pleased about that, but simultaneously they're also anxious that the Chinese are depriving other ethnic groups in Manila of jobs and opportunities to prosper. And it's a paradoxical formulation that's mirrored in British and American newspapers at the time. If you look at the archives, as I have, and research that, you'll see that exactly the same sort of mixed feelings were being projected at Chinese migrant workers in London and California. So there's a strange, as it were, kind of globalization of prejudice here towards the Chinese Filipinos that is informed not only by the activities and behaviors and of Chinese in Manila, but also attitudes towards migration to the UK and the US and what other Chinese are their sort of activities in the West too. Such victim blaming along the lines of labour and capital bears a very intriguing and also chilling parallel, I think, with European anti-Semitism, which, according to David Nirenberg, grew out of medieval laws barring Jews from many economic activities, which we know, and which then had the effect of channeling Jews into specific financial institutions such as money lending and tax collecting. And you can, see, if you look at the Victorian and Edwardian unease about exactly these sorts of attitudes, Manilaist writing of this time about both lower and upper class Chinese and their greed and their sort of parsimony and so on. At the same time, you had plenty of British novelists, from G.K. Chesterton to Hilaire Belloc to even Disraeli, sketching Jews as skillful accumulators of property, poor, insular and submissive, and guilty of financial crimes such as the 1912 Marconi insider trading scandal. And a good proportion of these novels, along with much visual media of the same period, feature the stereotypical physiognomy of the Jew, the most infamous aspect, which is an exaggeratedly large nose. As Sarah Lipton argues, this characteristic probably originated in mid-medieval art as a derogatory emblem of the Jew's misdirected gaze away from Christ, implying an heretical materialism inimical to Christian spiritualism. But later, the proboscis trope came to symbolize a form of materialism that's much closer to our modern understanding of the word. When money lending had become a leading enterprise in Europe, Jewish worldliness and fleshiness was underscored by luxurious clothing and exaggerated facial features, especially large hooked noses. Although redrawn slightly by subsequent incidents of economic scapegoating, such as the Jewish banking conspiracy peddled by fascists and some leftists in the 1930s and 40s, and unfortunately still with us today, the stereotype has survived more or less intact to the present day. And I think, similarly, in the second half of the 19th century, when social Darwinism was absolutely a la mode, and the US was enacting a series of eugenics laws that effectively banned Chinese immigration to the US at that time, Manilaist texts present certain biological attributes as the outward expression of their Chinese characters' mean, parsimonious, and or enterprising dispositions. So if you look at the work of then Governor of Hong Kong, John Bowring, who came to the Philippines in the 1840s, he reports that the Chinese physiognomy and the Chinese character had left their unmistakable traces in the whole population of a district of Panay Island, which is south of Manila. And then he goes on to append a description of the slanting position of the Chinese men's eyes, forming an angle over the nose, the beardless chin, the long and delicate fingers, with the claim the Indians, by which he means the Malay-Filipinos, believe them, the Chinese, to be masters of the art of money getting. So there's this, quite clear sort of notion that the Chinese facial features are closely associated with their sort of behavioural attributes. But to understand the full implications of those menacing slanting eyes that Bowring writes about and delicate fingers for the unpleasant demeanour of the Chinese, you have to go ahead about 50 or so pages when he writes, "The Chinaman makes his profit buying the labour of the indebted and extorting its maximum with coarse and often cruel tyranny. The Chinese have a proverb that the Indian must be led with rice in the left hand of his master and a bamboo in the right." So there you see, I think, quite a kind of concerning and obviously chilling kind of parallel between depictions of the Jews in Europe and depictions of the Chinese Filipinos. And again, sort of very paradoxical, very contradictory, as these sorts of Orientalist constructions tend to be. But then a kind of new paradox comes into play towards the end of the century when an ascendant middle class of mixed-race Chinese, they were called mestizos, produced both the wealthy business people who shored up the socio-economic status quo, and also the leading personalities of the Filipino revolutionary movement that sought to overturn that status quo by achieving independence from Spain. And ultimately they went to war against Spain and the Americans to do that. So Manilaism of that time invests this ambiguity in Chinese characters who are sort of outwardly respectable yet ultimately untrustworthy when dealing with Westerns. And you see examples of this in the Clavering Gunter text, Jack Curzon, who is constantly the sort of British merchant, adventurer, hero of that book, has constantly been kind of double-crossed and tricked by Chinese characters who he thinks he can trust but can't in the end. Even though such patent Sinophobia lulled as the 20th century wore on, geopolitical events seem to be to ensure that innuendos about Chinese elitism and money-grabbing survive, though faintly, in the works of the travel writer Raymond Nelson, who wrote a book about the Philippines called The Philippines, imaginatively enough, in about 1969, and more contemporary writers like Timothy Moe and Duncan Mackenzie, who's an Australian memoirist. And again, these texts are arguably responding to the swift rise of the People's Republic of China, to regional superpower status and the consequences of this new multilateral world order for the Philippines. But come the election of Rodrigo Duterte in 2016, the anti-Chinese sentiment reignites, and hypocrisy is very much a part of the kindling, if you like. At the same time as overlooking or vindicating the exercising of American hard and soft power over the Philippines, Jonathan Miller, who I mentioned earlier, and other journalists mostly, and sort of literary journalists, exaggerate China's military and economic threat to Manila, the rest of Southeast Asia, and the West. And I'll just move on now to, very quickly, I mentioned Duterte. I don't know how much people know about the current crisis in the Philippines. So this fellow was elected in 2016 on the promise of bringing an end to all crime in the Philippines, and that hasn't happened as you'd expect. But what he has done is killed perhaps 20 to 30,000 people, drug users and drug addicts, using sort of hitmen and sending police to go out and basically commit extrajudicial killings against drug users and addicts. So for this reason, Duterte in the Philippines has been back in the public eye in the West. You know, I think it's almost a kind of rule in Western media, Western journalism, that the non-Western world is not really isn't really kind of focused on, or doesn't make the news unless there's some awful crisis going on. And this is precisely what's going on. So what I wanted to do is to look at another dimension of the sort of more contemporary discourse around Duterte, and how he constitutes another kind of paradox or a conundrum really to the tenets of modern day Manilist writing. So in one sense, Duterte is the apotheosis of Manilist templates across the ages. He's the ultimate cacique, you know, whether it's, you know, what I mentioned about the way the kind of the Spanish are kind of represented, Spanish governors being kind of brutal tyrants. We haven't talked about Ferdinand Marcos, but if you look at Manilist writings of the 60s and 70s, there is this depiction of him as, you know, the kind of strongman dictator figure. And so Duterte is, you know, if you like, the kind of the epitome of that: vain, brash, impulsive, anti-democratic, and unrepentantly violent. And he also happens to meet most of the criteria that Gaurushard proposes for Oriental despotism, as it was articulated by those French intellectuals I talked about. So Manilism's application of these same criteria to Duterte leaves them open, I think, to the same criticisms as their Gallic forebears. So the journalists Jonathan Miller and Tom Smith, amongst others, are quick to denounce the fear, populism, political divisiveness, summary executions, and administrative catastrophes of Duterte's Manila, and they're not wrong to do that. I think, you know, there's certainly an argument that it's a pretty awful situation. But like O'Rourke and Ian Broome before them, they are generally oblivious to the complicity of almost 40 years of Western neoliberal policy in contributing to this predicament, not to say the sort of longer legacies of direct colonialism. The Filipino global development expert Alden Bello asserts that in the 1980s and 90s, the US-dominated World Bank and IMF plunged the Philippines into extreme debt and massive poverty by imposing free market trade, industry, land and spending reforms. And over subsequent decades, what Bello calls this neoliberal disarmament caused the Philippines to lag behind most of its neighbours in terms of poverty reduction and annual average growth rate. The mushrooming debt burden resulted in acute underinvestment in infrastructure and human services, and so alienated really from this economic and political order, millions of Filipinos voted for Duterte's heady populism. You know, as we see in other parts of the world, there's someone, Mr. Quick Fix, you know, someone comes on and says, look, I'm going to vote for me and I'll sort out all your problems, but I'm going to be violent and I'm going to be, you know, emphatic and I'm going to be authoritarian about it. So Manilism's excision of this, I think, quite important detail would also, I think, invest a certain amount of hypocrisy in this kind of in its withering portrayal of Duterte as this kind of alien, aberrant bogeyman. As another Filipino scholar, Neferti Tadiar, observes, it was precisely the unintended consequences of self-interested Western policy towards the Third World in the late 20th century that laid the groundwork for Filipino politicians of Duterte's strain. And I quote, "The rise of the strongman regime as a World Bank-endorsed response to the growing and intensifying crises felt in the nation as a result of the political and economic system installed by US colonization being pushed to its limits by the acceleration of global capital." There are other things to be said about that, but I think what I'll do is I'll just move forward and kind of finish on a few words about how it is possible to contest and challenge and interrogate these paradigms and these models that we're talking about, lest we get too depressed, about the kind of dominance of these, hundreds of years of problematic representations. And to go back to Said just for a moment, in a 2003 retrospective essay that I think he wrote for The Guardian, Said argued that writers and researchers native to the Middle East can contest the semi-mythical construct of Orientalism because history is made by men and women, just as it can also be unmade and rewritten, so that our East, our Orient, becomes ours to possess and direct. As for those non-natives of the Orient who want to avoid the problematic simplifications of Orientalism, it is, Said avers, perfectly possible to obtain knowledge of other peoples that is the result of understanding, compassion, careful study, and analysis for their own sakes. So with this in mind, I just want to mention what you might call a kind of counter-hegemonic lineage of texts, written by both natives, to use Said's, Filipinos and non-Filipinos, that have opposed, subverted, or deconstructed, or in some ways challenged the sort of, as I say, the paradigms that I've mentioned so far. And again, I'm going to, forgive me for just sort of slightly skimming over this, but at least if I can point you in the direction to some, I think very intriguing and very important texts. So the Filipino poet and lyrical essayist Luis H. Francia and the Australian travel writer Maslin Williams exhibit a refreshing self-reflexivity, you can see their books up there, that acknowledges the fallibility and the contingency of their own observations, their own approaches to research and epistemology and gathering knowledge. And in the case of Williams, at least, because he is a foreigner, his status as a Western professional writer trying to report on a post-colonial site. There is a kind of a self-reflexivity and a sort of self-awareness of that. Just to give you an example, Williams is self-conscious about the limitations of his outlook because he is open to having his preconceptions challenged by the Filipinos he encounters. So in his book Faces of My Neighbour, which is published in the early 70s, he encounters a former medical student and has a discussion with him about the relative merits of communism and liberal democracy as was at that time. And they agree that both involve masters and slaves, and that when either system enters into a conflict situation, it becomes tyrannical, ruthless, and cruel. But suddenly and unexpectedly, Williams's interviewee loses his temper and begins to rail against the hypocrisy of Westerners condemning the Philippines' human rights record, while their own, and I'll quote, countrymen run the biggest, most corrupt and insidious armaments business in history. Although fazed by this tirade, Williams admits that it is shot through with truth and is persuaded enough by its logic that he concludes his trip to Manila on this thought: our pretenses and our hypocrisies are part of the Philippines' history, the hard part, during which it has been subjugated, cheated, betrayed, and treated as third rate. And there's nothing like that kind of epiphany. None of the writers that I've mentioned earlier, none of the sort of Manilaist writers have ever come anywhere near to that kind of, epiphany or level of self-awareness, as you can imagine. So I just want to mention some of the writers: the polymathic Filipino author Nick Joaquin, Filipino novelists Jessica Hagedorn and Gina Apostol, defy Manilaism's generalizing caricatures of people and places by subverting those images or writing in the shadow of Filipino rather than Western authors who belittle or censor those aspects of Manila they find distasteful. And this often involves applying techniques of satire and parody designed to variously interrogate and provide alternatives to the sort of cliches and kind of models of Manila's prose. So Hagedorn's book Dog Eaters, which you can see on the corner there, again, very much recommended, published in 1991, is an intertextual, temporally disjointed postmodern novel that charts the fortunes of a well-connected Manila family from the 1950s through to the 1990s. And it's intercut with excerpts from 19th century Western texts whose turgid rhetoric ironically counterpoints the gritty, sordid realities of late 20th century Manila. So for instance, an 1898 address by President McKinley, who was the US president in charge when the US went to the Philippines, invaded the Philippines, an address that he gave to Methodist clergy in which he promises, by God's grace, to uplift and civilize and Christianize Manila, then Luzon, then other islands, prefaces a chapter in Hagedorn's text about an American tourist drunkenly harassing a Filipino male sex worker in a dingy 1980s Manila nightclub. I would just mention that there are other authors who, such as Tom Bauschorth, the Australian travel writer, and the contemporary Filipino novelist Jose Y. Dalisay, who meditate on the deep and complex material drivers of the poverty, despair, and alienation that Manila's topographies either take for granted or fetishize, while someone like, a figure like the travel journalist Madis Margarero conveys an alternative Manila whose coordinates of working class hope, agency, solidarity, and community are distressingly, but then also predictably absent from the Manilist symbolic order. And I'll just sort of finish on this thought, I think, if that's all right. I think have I gone massively over time, Neil, or am I?
No, you're good.
About right? Okay, good. It's just a couple more minutes, I promise. So Neferti Tadiar, the Filipino historian and theorist I mentioned earlier, if she's correct that the Philippine state's deployment and manipulation of the codes of international fantasy has had the material impact of fundamentally enabling the systemic exploitation and oppression of the great majority of Filipino lives, then I think it might be fair to speculate that Manilaism's deployment of representational codes has had a similar enabling effect on Western structures of oppression, and that critically analysing these codes isn't just a sort of pure academic affair of fattening the body of research into the kind of nuts and bolts of how this works formally and so on. To see these works on a purely textual level, I think it's also very important to the political task of disputing that kind of elite rhetoric or these elite arguments or the elite discourse, I suppose, to sort of stay within the sort of correct terminology that endorses the various forms of oppression that I've sort of alluded to, past and present. And indeed, I think the direction that arguably our wider geopolitics that is going, and dangerous as it is at the moment, then maybe was it ever thus, you could say, which is so often, not only enabled, but kind of rooted in fear, misrepresentation, misunderstanding of, the other, whether we're talking about other cultures, other societies, groups, individuals. So yes, that's me. Thank you.